So, are you done with school?
I am. I graduated last night.
I've been working
All right, welcome. I'm glad you all could come. You see we've got full house today. Everybody like this topic. For those of you who I haven't met face-to-face, I'm LaFayette Road, and I'm director of the City's Research Library and Municipal Archives. And typically our role is to deal with records and archives, but we also get to do a lot of history with that. So we've got a great speaker here today. Dr. Jonathan Bryant is a professor of history at Georgia Southern University. He holds both a JD and a PhD degree in his degrees, and he specializes in the history of American law, slavery, and emancipation. Jonathan believes small places tell big stories, and he loves unearthing tales that have been long been forgotten. I think the Antelope is a great case of that. He's also the author of a book that's just come out about the Antelope called Dark Places of the Earth, The Voyage of the Slave Ship Antelope. He also authored How Curious a Land, Conflict and Change in Greene County, 1850 to 1885. He was a contributor to the Slavery and Freedom in Savannah volume that came out last year in conjunction with the Telfair Museums. And he's also contributed to Citizenship and the Reconstruction South in Georgia and Black and White Explorations and Race Relations of a Southern State. I've had the opportunity to hear Dr. Bryant talk about the Antelope story on 2 different occasions, and it's really a fascinating story and very important to Savannah's history, but he'll really help put it into that national importance that it really needs, it deserves. So I'm excited he came all the way from Statesboro and made it here, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Bryant.
Maybe there's a traffic engineer here in town who can help them figure out how to make I-16 work. I spent 40 minutes, I'm not kidding you, 40 minutes barely moving, thanks to the construction on I-16. Of course, then, when I got here, the State Street garage was full. So I found a parking place and managed to dig out 50 cents. So I'm going to contribute to the budget of the city of Savannah, parking ticket, and that's just how it goes. I'm very glad. Well, I don't know. I'm very glad to be here again. Seriously, if there's a traffic engineer in here, you just need to set up a system that makes people alternate. But you guys are living with it more than me. I thought, well, I'll get there at 11 o'clock. There won't be any traffic problems then. So I learned. I'm very glad to be here. Luciana is an incredibly welcoming presence in the archive. If you've had to go there to do anything, it's a wonderful thing. I will admit, last fall, when she invited me to do this, the book was expected to come out during the winter. That hasn't happened. The publisher pushed it back. It's not coming out actually until July. And when my colleagues asked me about this, I joked. I said, well, there must have been some new book on Ebola or something that I had to bring out. So I went to the website to get a cover shot for today. What I find, I kid you not. But be afraid, be very afraid. Nonetheless, the book will come out this summer, and this is from the Shameless Commerce Department. You're going to get a little more of that too. It's available for pre-order on the Norton website, and it's also on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, etc. You can get it as an ebook, you can get it as a recorded book. So there's a variety of different ways to get it. If this presentation is not enough of me, you just gotta have more of me, as Luciana mentioned, the recent 2014 volume from the Telfair, Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, which is, quite seriously, even though it's constructed for an educated public audience, people like you, it is the most recent scholarship on this subject, but there's a lot more scholarship to be done. There's a lot more that's going to be coming in the future. And if that doesn't satisfy you, you can, of course, buy the last book I wrote, which looks at the transformation of an extraordinarily wealthy plantation community before the Civil War through Reconstruction, emancipation, and the processes, in particular, the role that the law plays in reducing a 2/3 African-American county, reducing those African-Americans to what can only be described as debt peonage. We call it sharecropping. So if you have an interest in these things, I do write them. You can find that at the UNC Press website, but it's a much cheaper on the Amazon site. So that was like going to the movies, wasn't it? You know, you go in, you're expecting your movie, and damn, there's all these advertisements. What's going to happen to you? So since we're talking about the movies, maybe we should begin today with a movie many of you are familiar with. Amistad, one of Steven Spielberg's works. It's really considered part of a trilogy that he did that began with Schindler's List and Amistad and then Saving Private Ryan. It's been it's overshadowed by Saving Private Ryan, which is a much better movie. And while Amistad, if you really sit and watch it, is a very polished piece, as you would expect, it fails as a historical piece. And there are many ways that this movie changes the historical story, plays with chronology, does a host of things that in some ways I think misrepresents the achievement of the Amistad case. But the one I find most glaring is the way Anthony Hopkins portrayed John Quincy Adams. You may remember Adams is shown sleeping, he's shown pottering around his garden, he's shown as this almost uninvolved individual. As usual, the costumes and the makeup are astonishing. Hopkins does look a lot like John Quincy Adams. There's Hopkins as John Quincy Adams, and there's John Quincy Adams as John Quincy Adams. I mean, this is good dang makeup if you think about it, guys. That's pretty remarkable. But the character's bent to fit the plot. And the Adams, as I mentioned, he's detached, he's focused on his plants, he's pottering around his house. He has to be drawn into the case, he has to be seduced, doesn't he, if you know this very well, into taking on this case. And when he finally appears before the Supreme Court, what follows is kind of this rambling discourse on the founders, who of course he knew personally, and the principles that they espoused. This is one place where the movie really failed, because this should be the climax, and it was unclimactic, if you follow me. Spielberg would have been better served by history here. The real John Quincy Adams was an anti-slavery activist by the 1830s. He had visited the Amistad captives in jail soon after their capture and participated eagerly as an advisor to the case. Rather than wandering around the courtroom making genial comments about justice and calling on the court to do the right thing, Adams presented more than 7 hours of closely argued material and evidence over the course of 2 days in this case. Sometimes his arguments rambled, sometimes his witticisms fell short, he made errors, but on the whole he gave a fascinating and brilliant performance. During the night after Adams' first day of presenting to the Supreme Court, one of the justices, Philip Barber, died in his sleep. And so the court had to adjourn, they had to have the funeral of the justice. Think about this, you're halfway through your argument, and now you're going to have to come back and present the rest of your argument after that. When they met again, the courtroom was filled, there's no other way to put it, with a consciousness of death. We're talking about the Amistad case. A consciousness of death. This justice who had just died, and a consciousness of age. You have a 74-year-old man standing in front of you to argue. There's a snowstorm raging outside, but nonetheless, John Quincy Adams spoke for more than 2 hours about the most important case controlling the decision in the Amistad, and that, of course, was the case of the Antelope. The printed version of John Quincy Adams' argument in front of the Supreme Court is 135 pages long, and 41 of those pages is his argument, the first really analysis of the Antelope case that's ever been published. As to the court's decision in the Antelope, and you'll learn more about this in a little bit, but Adams argued One step further, and the case of the Antelope would have conferred unfading glory on the Supreme Court. One step more, and the heartless sophistry would have been silenced, and the cold-blooded apathy to human suffering would have been stung into sensibility. This step was not taken. There lacked one voice in a divided court to reverse the whole of that decree of the circuit court. Adams insisted that he intended no insult to John Marshall, no criticism of Joseph Story, who was still a sitting justice and who had heard that previous case, but he argued the Supreme Court had failed in its duty that day. Adams, as you will see, however, did not apologize for failing in his own duty to this case. So what was the case of the Antelope? It began in the summer of 1820 off the coast of Florida and Georgia. For several days, Captain John Jackson, who was based here at St. Mary's, that was an international border at the time. Florida is Spanish Florida still. He is the commander of a revenue cutter, and he'd begun to hear rumors. It's very important if you're trying to stop smuggling and other things that you have people out in the community bringing you rumors and stories and information. All police organizations have to do this, and in essence, the Revenue Marine, predecessor to our Coast Guard, is conducting itself as a police organization here. A piratical vessel, the rumors said, hovered off the coast at St. Augustine, and it had turned north. So Jackson commanded the revenue cutter Dallas with himself aboard to sail down the St. Mary's River, and they crossed the bar on June 28th in 1820. The next morning, they spotted a brig, and the chase was on. The cutter was faster. It soon caught the fleeing brig, and then, quote, half a pistol shot apart, only a bit more than a dozen yards, an armed standoff followed. Captain Jackson hailed, demanding the brig's identity. "This is the Patriot brig of war, General Ramirez," came the reply. The brig's master, John Smith, came aboard the revenue cutter carrying a privateering commission from Jose Artigas, the protector of the Banda Oriental, which was a revolutionary predecessor to the nation of Uruguay. How's that for obscure? The General Ramirez, he said, was a prize of war, and she was formerly a Spanish vessel named the Antelope. Smith also explained that his ship desperately needed water. The cutter's boarding party immediately discovered why. Packed aboard the brig, a ship about 80 feet long and 25 feet wide, were, quote, 281 African Negroes and the bodies of 2 others who were lying dead on the deck. This is actually a ship called the Vigilante, which was captured in 1823, very similar in size and layout to the Antelope. And this is a pretty accurate description of what the boarding party would have found. You get a better idea here of the situation that the captives are in aboard this ship. The living captives were sick, they were dehydrated, they were starving. Frankly, I'm not sure I can imagine their suffering. You know, because you live here. This is the heat of a Florida summer. The stench alone, I suspect, of blood, urine, feces, death, must have been overwhelming for the men who had to go below deck. And this is how this case of the Antelope began. It's a sprawling story of pirates and privateers, the illegal slave trade, corruption, and growing conflict nationally over slavery's expansion. It involves James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, John Marshall, Francis Scott Key. They all play a central role in this story. In the courts, a 7-year struggle began over freedom for the captives, who were worth a fortune if they were enslaved. There followed 6 visits to the United States Circuit Court, 3 visits to the United States Supreme Court. I can't tell you the whole story today, which shameless Commerce Department is why you should buy the forthcoming book. Or is that product placement? I don't know what that is. Instead, I'm going to focus on events in Savannah and the court case involving the captives found aboard the ship. Some points to remember. 25 of the original Antelope captives came from an American ship the exchange out of Bristol, Rhode Island, and the slave trade was illegal under American law beginning January 1, 1808, and in fact, in May of 1820, the same year, slave trading by an American had been made a capital crime with the punishment of death. Yeah. The rest of the captives, originally over 300, came from Spanish and Portuguese vessels that had loaded them at Cabinda in West Central Africa. Under a law that had just been passed in 1819, and it has this title, don't you love laws, titles? An act in addition to the acts passed to prohibit the importation of slaves. If you've ever messed with this stuff, you have to go back and find that other act and see what it says, and then you have to, you know how this works. But under this law, captives aboard slavers seized by United States authorities were to be placed under the authority of the president and returned to Africa. Very, very interesting. Returned to Africa. Now, Savannah in 1820, and many of you have probably seen this before, was a seasonal city. We forget that a little bit, I think, today. During the winter, when rice and lumber and ever-increasing amounts of cotton were shipped out to the world, Savannah was a bustling place. Busy, busy, busy. Just as is depicted along the wharves there. That would be River Street, of course, nowadays where they are. Sailors and longshoremen thronged the taverns and the flesh pots in Yamacraw on the west side of town. Merchants, factors, and planters carried on the closing of that year's business. Dozens of ships at a time crowded up to the wharfs, taking the produce to all regions of the world. Perhaps 9,000 or 10,000 people crowded into Savannah in the 18-teens and 1820s to make all of this possible. And then summer was the doldrums. Most of the sailors and longshoremen were gone. Merchants, factors, and planters who could afford to left for the upcountry or for northeastern states. The population probably dropped to as low as 5,000 people, and business stagnated. I don't have to describe to you guys how Savannah stands on a sand bluff, and clay is in it as well. But it's interesting to reflect on the physical differences of that time. Not a single street in Savannah was paved. The ramps to the river were not paved. To get from the river to town, you had to struggle up that 40-foot steep bank of sand, deep, loose sand. Then the streets were sand as well. Locals explained to visitors that the sand streets were restful. None of that horrid clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, right, to disturb your thoughts. But visitors had their own ideas. I could give you a million quotes. I just have two here. One dubbed Savannah a wooden town on a sand heap, and described walking through the sand as something similar to wading through snowdrifts. Even George Washington, when he visited here in the 1790s, wrote in his diary, quote, "Walking was disagreeable." Savannah in 1820, as you may well know, was in dire straits. First off, the so-called Panic of 1819 had had a dramatic impact on the volume of commerce in town. By 1820, the value of commerce in Savannah had fallen to less than half of what it had been 2 years before. To make things worse, in January of 1820, a huge fire swept through the sand heap, destroying that wooden town, many homes and businesses. The people of Savannah were desperate for some good fortune, and the providential arrival of the Antelope seemed to be it. Illegal slavers had come into Savannah before, in 18, and there are many, I can tell you story after story if you want, in questions, but in 1817, for example, 3 illegal slave ships packed with a total of more than 260 captives had been brought into Savannah. Archibald S. Bullock, who was the collector at that time in Savannah, explained that these captives had been bonded out to himself and to Thomas U.P. Charlton, later mayor. Quote, "Under the influence of humanity," Bullock wrote to the Secretary of the Treasury, "it appears to be my duty to interest myself for these sufferers. And having an estate near the city, I have taken possession of 40 in number." So Bullock then humanely put 40 captives to work on his plantation for no pay. The rest of the captives were bonded out to local planters until the federal court could decide their case. In essence, what happened was they took them to the front of the courthouse and auctioned them. Charlton had given a bond of $200 for each captive, but when auctioned on Wright Square, the bonds given averaged $300 per captive. Pretty good profit, huh? All involved understood this was really a purchase. No one intended to return these earlier captives when they were called for by the court. They would just give up their bond, and they'd gotten a slave for $300. Does everybody understand how that would have worked? Everybody was happy. The court had money to pay the claimants. Bullock and Charlton made a good profit, and the purchasers had new slaves from Africa. But in July of 1820, when the captives from the Antelope were turned over to the United States Marshal, John H. Morrell, people may have expected a similar result, but they didn't get it. He received 258 captives. 22 more had died since the Antelope was captured. These 258 captives were valued at a minimum of $77,000, which was a fortune in fire-ravaged and depressed Savannah. Marshal Morrell, however, was shocked by the captives delivered to him. The average age of the captives was less than 14. 106 of the captives, 41%, were between the ages of 5 and 10. 8 captives were between 3 and 5 years of age. They were all weak, dehydrated, and sick. Half could not even walk. The terror of captivity, of the Middle Passage, in which more than 70 captives had died, had all been inflicted upon children. But the captives' ordeal had only begun. Morrell arranged for the captives to camp at the racetrack west of town. Some of you are familiar with the new historic marker that was put out there. Very, very interesting stuff. It rained and rained and rained that summer, and the racetrack became a steaming, muddy horror of sick children, naked except for blankets, living in stables and in tents, and the captive children continued to die. Meanwhile, doctors discovered yellow fever in Savannah. By January of 1821, probably, the numbers aren't as good as for Savannah's other yellow fever epidemics, but probably 20% of the city's population, at least the white population, had died. No one bothered to count the deaths of the black population, but deaths among the captives were counted. 44 more of these captives died, 17% of those who had arrived. Finally, the marshal distributed the smaller captives, the really youngest children, to various households in the city where they worked as servants. 50 or 51, there's contrasting numbers. The National Archive materials say 50, the City of Savannah materials say 51. Luciano will help you work that out. They were given to the City of Savannah to work on leveling the remaining fortifications from the War of 1812, and they also worked on various tasks for the city. And then Marshal Morrell put some to work on his own plantation at the east end of Bryan Neck, Cottingham Plantation, right off of Redbird Creek. You guys may or may not know it. And this would become increasingly important. The Spanish vice consul here in Savannah and the Portuguese vice consul filed claims to recover the captives as property. Captain John Jackson, the commander of the revenue cutter, filed a salvage claim, a claim for a reward of a portion of the value of the cargo that he had saved. But United States Attorney Richard Wiley Habersham saw the captives differently. Writing to John Quincy Adams, Habersham explained that he, quote, intended to interpose a claim for the United States in order to make them a party before the court. This meant, in legal terms, that Habersham saw the captives as free persons with civil rights. As such, they could act as parties in a lawsuit for their own freedom. The implications of this argument probably really concerned Haversham's legal peers here in Savannah, but he proved incredibly stubborn and could not be swayed from his conviction that, quote, these people are entitled to their freedom. John Smith, the master of the Antelope, was charged with piracy. In Admiralty law, this is important, in Admiralty law, a pirate capturing property did not obtain a title to that property any more than a thief stealing something obtains title to that property. A legitimate privateer, which is an individual who contracts for a commission from a government to attack that government's enemies during war, a legitimate privateer, however, did win title to captured property. Haversham's best chance to free these captives would be for John Smith to be a legitimate privateer, not a pirate. And another of those stories, it's too long for me to tell here, I'm convinced that Richard Haversham deliberately followed a course of action that resulted in a verdict of not guilty for John Smith. In the Admiralty case that followed, Haversham argued that since Smith was not a pirate but a legitimate privateer, the capture of the Antelope extinguished any Spanish or Portuguese title. Aha, there's the reason. Smith owned the captives, and under the 1819 Slave Trade Act, the captives were then free. As free human beings with civil rights, the captives came before the court demanding their freedom as in a habeas corpus case. The United States are the mere nominal claimant. The Negroes are the actual party, Haversham argued. This is 1820. And in the United States, the way slavery is developing at this time is it has been very much racialized by 1820. People are seeing black means slave, white means not slave. This would not have been the case a century earlier, but by this time, that's very much how people thought. A wise lawyer, however, always has an argument in the alternative. Haversham argued that under the law of nations, the slave trade itself was illegal. He presented numerous British Admiralty cases to support this argument. No matter how the captives were acquired by the Portuguese and Spanish, if they still had title, under those cases, once those captives were taken on a journey across the Atlantic, they became free, because the African slave trade violated international law. Sitting as a judge in Admiralty, District Federal Court Judge William Davies ruled that since the privateer had fitted out in Baltimore, it had violated American law. The privateering voyage was illegal. John Smith was a pirate at law with no title to the captives, and the court had to consider instead the condition of the captives prior to the Antelope's capture. So he ruled that those 25 that had been taken from the American slave trader, the exchange, were covered by the 1819 law, and those 25 were free. The law did not apply to the other captives. Spanish and Portuguese law permitted the slave trade and created property rights, and these property rights must be honored. Judge Davies ordered that 7 captives, the remainder of the 25 taken from the American ship, would be turned over to the United States. The rest of the captives would be divided, all based on a system of calculating losses. They met to do this, to divvy up the slaves in the old city exchange, located where City Hall is now. So this is the document that they draw up. Here they're saying that the average loss comes out to be 7. And so there's only going to be 7 free. That for the Portuguese, they will receive 142 captives, and for the Spanish, they'll receive 63 out of the now. Remember when we start with 281? Now 212 captives who are still living. Attorney Haversham, U.S. Attorney Haversham, appealed to the Federal Circuit Court, and there Supreme Court Justice William Johnson of South Carolina heard the case. It was true, Johnson wrote, that the British Admiralty courts had ruled the slave trade illegal under the law of nations. But should an American court follow British law? Haversham, quote, turns our attention toward British decisions with a devotion scarcely consistent with judicial or natural independence. Perhaps Habersham, he suggested, was in, quote, mental subjection to the British. Perhaps he did not understand the meaning of American independence. Quote, the laws of any country on the subject of the slave trade are nothing more than the trade laws of the nation that made them, wrote Johnson. That being the case, an American court could not enforce American law or British law against Spanish and Portuguese vessels on the high seas. The slaves taken from the Spanish and Portuguese ships, Johnson ruled, should be returned to their owners. Johnson agreed with Davies that the 25 taken from the American ship fell under that 1819 Slave Trade Act, but he increased the number of slaves to 16. Concluding it was impossible to identify them, Johnson ordered a lottery to identify 16 men to be given freedom. They assembled them at William Richardson's house, which was right over in Spring Hill. Most of you know where this is. And the men drew lots. 15 men and boys ultimately made it from this to be among the first settlers of Liberia on the coast of West Africa. And their fascinating story is one for another time as well. On January 22nd of 1822, Habersham appealed the case to the Supreme Court. More than 3 years would pass before the Antelope Case was argued. And even then, it was only argued because Francis Scott Key pressed to hear the case heard. Key, who was a devoted supporter of an organization called the American Colonization Society that had established the colony in Liberia, wanted a ruling that the slave trade violated the law of nations, violated international law. If you had such a ruling, American naval vessels could sweep up all sorts of slave traders, and then those captives rescued would be sent to Liberia as settlers, making the Liberian colony a success. This is how the Capitol looked then. In fact, they just reconstructed it. As you know, the British burned it, right, during the War of 1812. This new dome was being completed as the Antelope Case finally came before the court. Right here is where the Supreme Court sat. In fact, these windows were behind the justices. You'll see in a moment. If you walked up and looked in the window, you'd see the back of the justices sitting in this courtroom, which is still there and really worth visiting if you visit the Capitol. It's a beautiful little room. Although some people said it was like going down into a cellar to get there and then had the feeling of doing justice in the corner. So it's a pretty small room. The Antelope Case began there on February 26th of 1825 and continued for 5 full days of argument. Francis Scott Key opened for the federal government. The captives, Key argued, should be treated as if they were thrown upon our shore by a storm. As with any castaways, the captives of the Antelope were free the moment they arrived in the United States. The Spanish law allowing the slave trade, he argued, is not only contrary to ours, but inconsistent with the law of nature. He then told the 6 justices sitting for this case, 4 of whom owned slaves, that by the law of nature, all men are free. Key tried to turn the burden of proof on the claimants. They must show that under international law the captives were slaves, or else the presumption had to be that they were free. This was no idle requirement, for what was at stake was not mere property, but human liberty. Senator John McPherson Berrien, his house is just down the street here, isn't it? Who was representing the Spanish claimants, replied there was nothing mere about property. He summarized Key's argument and highlighted the implications. If the court accepted Key's assertions of the primacy of natural rights, Berrien argued, then, quote, we are bound prima facie to hold that there can be no property in a human being. He let that sit for a moment. Then he moved to a logical destruction of Key's presentation, going point by point from a numbered list. I don't know how much you know about John McPherson Berrien. He's not always, in our view, a nice guy, but he is a brilliant lawyer. There's no question about that. He ridiculed Key's ethical arguments. Could the United States impose its morality upon the world? The answer was no. Then Charles Jared Ingersoll appeared for the Portuguese and attacked the idea of there even being a law of nations, much less one prohibiting slavery. There was no such thing, and the property had to be restored to its rightful owners. Finally, the Attorney General of the United States, William Wirt, closed. The Africans are parties to the cause, at least such of them as are free, he told the court. These Africans are not effects or merchandise, they are human beings, and thus the case is similar to a habeas corpus claim. In such a case, what proof would the court require to keep anyone detained, or worse, to hold them in lifelong slavery? The court would require compelling and overwhelming evidence of the legitimacy of the detention. The evidence presented by the Spanish vice consul, would argue, was insufficient to show that any of the captives were Spanish slaves. The Portuguese vice consul had presented no owners or proof at all. John Marshall, at this time, the justices, they wouldn't even announce it ahead of time. They would begin each day in court by reading decisions from prior cases. And so on March 15th of 1825, John Marshall read the court's opinion. In the third paragraph, he wrote, any of you in here attorneys? No? Oh well, you don't even have to be an attorney to understand the implications of this. Marshall wrote, in examining claims of this momentous importance, claims in which the sacred rights of liberty and of property come in conflict with each other, this court must not yield to feelings which might seduce it from the path of duty and must obey the mandate of the law. I know that both Key and Wirt were in the courtroom when this was read, and I am quite sure when they heard that, not leading the path of duty, can't let emotions lead us, they knew they'd lost. After a discussion of several precedents, Marshall ruled that slavery resulted from positive law, that means law made by a legislature or a treaty or some other sort of law, and that positive law superseded natural law. Marshall then turned to the question of, quote, whether the slave trade is prohibited by the law of nations. The slave trade, he admitted, was, quote, contrary to the law of nature. For the law of nature was not the law of nations. Wandering in a sea of indeterminacy, Marshall argued a jurist must search for a legal solution. And considering the long history of the existence of slavery and the long history of the existence of the slave trade, he ruled that, quote, international law is decidedly in favor of the legality of the trade. Now, all was not lost. Wirt had powerfully attacked on that issue of proof. The captives alone, not a big general dispute, but the captives alone could still win their freedom if the court ruled there was insufficient proof that the captives were slaves. But here, Wirt and Key were disappointed. The Supreme Court had divided 3 justices to 3 justices, and thus could not rule on the issue. The circuit court ruling stood. All that remained was dividing up the spoils. As was often the case with John Marshall, here there was a surprise. While the court had split on the issue of proof, they agreed that there were some problems with the claims to the captives. The survivors of the slaves that had been aboard the Antelope, the court said, that had belonged to the Spanish, would be given to the Spanish because they had produced an owner, Cuesta Manzanel, a firm in Cuba. The Portuguese, however, had produced no owner or financial interest, even though they'd had more than 5 years to do so. As a result, the Portuguese claim was extinguished. Those captives would instead go to the United States to be freed in Africa. Over the next 2 years, the freed captives continued to work like slaves, mostly on Marshall Morell's plantation, while the Supreme Court twice heard additional issues in the case. Finally, in July of 1827, 121 surviving captives, what did we start with, 281? And actually in Africa you start with 331. So from 331 to 121, captives left Savannah on the ship Norfolk. In Liberia, the captives settled along Stockton Creek in a town they named, it's still there, New Georgia. These liberated captives averaged about 21 years of age when they arrived in Liberia in 1827. Excuse me, 16 years later, in 1843, there was a census of these captives. And the census found that more than 80% of those who had arrived on the Norfolk had died. Only 22 Antelope captives were still living in 1843. Freedom, quite ironically, had meant being sent to a death trap. A year later, a private law passed by Congress, it's a complicated story, but gave Congressman Richard Henry Wilde of Georgia possession of the Spanish share, 39 slaves. Wilde and Florida Territorial Representative Joseph White purchased a plantation together in North Florida and named it Casa Bianca. There, the Antelope captives were put to work with others producing Sea Island cotton and sugar cane. The plantation was profitable, and a decade later, Wilde sold his share and retired to Florence, Italy. There, he spent his days writing truly bad epic poetry and pondering the works of Dante. This photograph was made around 1900. This house burned in 1903. And I wish we knew more. There's two African American men here in the photograph, and might they be descendants of these Antelope captives? We don't know. When people ask why I became fascinated with this case, I always reply that it's the most important Supreme Court case they've never heard of. And let me give two reasons for that. First, Marshall's ruling that positive law trumped both international law and natural law. This neutered that inconvenient preamble to the Declaration of Independence, the assertion that all men are created equal and have an inalienable right to liberty. This point echoes through a chain of cases: the Amistad, Groves v. Slaughter, Prigg v. Pennsylvania, Strader v. Graham, and of course Dred Scott v. Sanford. Only in the last case, Dred Scott, did the Supreme Court finally answer Richard W. Haversham's assertion that the captives were parties before the court. No, this was not possible, according to the Tanning Court. As for Africans, they have no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and no one of African heritage could sue in American courts because they were property. They've been bought and sold as ordinary merchandise whenever a profit could be made. Second, had the Supreme Court ruled that the slave trade violated international law, the American flag could not have sheltered the illegal trade at sea. This may not have ended the slave trade, but it would have made a substantial dent in it. Instead, the Antelope decision facilitated the slave trade's continuance for another 40 years. There were more than 4,000 successful slaving voyages from Africa to the Americas between 1826 and 1866. During this period, and this is mostly going to Cuba and Brazil, during this period, more than 1,700,000 people were loaded aboard slave ships in Africa, and over 1,500,000 additional slaves arrived in the United States. You are right, there is a difference between the two, and that difference means that more than 170,000 people were directly killed by the continuance of the slave trade. Slavery, wrote John Marshall in the Antelope decision, has its origin in force. But as the world has agreed that it is a legitimate result of force, the state of things which is thus produced by general consent cannot be pronounced unlawful. Because the slave trade was not pronounced unlawful, thousands upon thousands of more human beings would die. So what of John Quincy Adams? Adams was Secretary of State when the Antelope was captured. He was inaugurated as president one day after the first Antelope Case's arguments concluded in the Supreme Court. There was no Justice Department at that time. U.S. attorneys fell under the authority of the Secretary of State. Recognizing this, U.S. Attorney Richard W. Haversham had written numerous reports and constantly inquired of Adams for advice in the case. Not once did Adams bother to answer. Not once did he take any public action, either as Secretary of State or as President, regarding the case. nor did he take any action to shorten the duration of the legal conflict. His memoirs reveal many discussions of this case with William Wirt, with President Monroe, but Adams, who was clearly a candidate for president in 1824, did nothing. The international slave trade was considered a central moral and political crisis of the time, but John Quincy Adams played it safe, saying nothing, hoping to be elected president. So what drives a 74-year-old man to speak for 7 hours before the Supreme Court? What drives him to publish at his own expense a 135-page booklet explaining the argument? I'll leave that to you to decide. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Bryan?
Did I bore you too severely? That was 45 minutes and it was meant to be 35, so I apologize for that.
Well, I think sometimes all the legal stuff is very confusing, so it'd be good to condense that in. And hearing the actual numbers of people who kind of came to Savannah and then left or went here or died is really kind of just eye-opening. I mean, we all know that slavery was horrible, but to actually put it into, you know, where there's specific numbers that affected Savannah and Savannah's history is really fascinating.
Before long, by 1823, these captives had been accorded names. And then, of course, when they go to Liberia, they have full names. They get not just a first name, but they also have a last name. And to me, one of the moments you have when you're researching is I'm looking through the census, 1843 census from Liberia, and I see one woman whose name in 1823 was Hope, you know, just given one name because you're a slave. And in 1843, her name was recorded as Despair Hope. So a very, very, how do I put it? It's a forgotten case in a lot of ways because it's frankly depressing. There is no other way to think about this. And you lay down the precedent that property is more important than natural rights of human beings, which I would argue may even be a problem our society struggles with today. But that's up to you. It was just real quick, guys, this is literally the first photograph ever made of an American president. It was taken in 1843, a daguerreotype. It's John Quincy Adams. No other president had posed for, or this is a former president, of course, had posed for a photograph before this. But this is right exactly at the time he argued that Amistad case. So he was an old cooter when he was in front of the Supreme Court.
Sorry.
Yes.
Why do you think that he finally decided to argue and publish?
John Quincy Adams, by the way, his memoirs, seriously, if you are a reader who wants to read very accessible primary documents, this is a really incredible guy. He spent more time in Europe than in the United States as a diplomat early in his life. He would walk every morning. His partners he would walk with ranged from Tsar Alexander of Russia to the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Just remarkable stuff. And he records all this in this incredibly detailed diary that is later published in multi-volume work. They've got it at the Bull Street Library. I don't think you guys have it. After he lost re-election in 1828 to Andrew Jackson, his son committed suicide. He found that he was almost insolvent financially. He moved back to Massachusetts where everyone ignored him, and he fell into literally what we would call today a deep depression. He even writes one day in his diary, I see no reason for my life to continue. And then some neighbors come and ask him to run for Congress, and as you probably know, he's the only president to then, after he served as president, to go back into Congress. And in many ways, suddenly it seems as if he matters more as a congressman than he did as president. And because, in a lot of ways, perhaps the personal change that came with that depression, the death of his son, etc., he becomes this incredibly powerful advocate in Congress for the end of slavery, and commits himself to this cause. And I mean, this is a very knowledgeable man, a great debater, etc. The Southern slaveholders hate him with a passion. In fact, after the Antelope Case, he became very interested in the larger question of the illegal slave trade that was still going on and how Americans were involved. And he found all sorts of evidence of important Americans, wealthy, powerful Americans in the North who were financing the slave trade. And then after 6 months of this, he wrote in his diary, I'm 75 years old, I can't do this, someone else has to take up this cause. And of course, no one did. So why did he do this? I think it's implied by everything I've said, but he feels guilty, I'm convinced, about doing nothing to help these Antelope captives. And now with the Amistad case, he has a chance to redeem himself. That's what I would argue. In fact, what I argue in the book. Yes?
I know you probably said this in the beginning, but I probably missed it.
It's a long presentation, I'm sorry.
What was the size of the antelope, and was there any information on the antelope's middle passage?
There is some information about that. The antelope was probably on deck about 80 feet long. Of course, there's a bowsprit and other things.
Yeah.
It probably was no wider than 25 feet on deck. And then they crammed 300 plus people into this. Over time, as you probably know, during the middle passage, people are sick, people die, people get diarrhea, all sorts of horrid things happen to the individuals who are stacked like logs, really, down in the hold. And slave ships begin to take on a stench. So much so that British naval officers wrote that a real slaver, you could smell it 3 or 4 miles away. It's that bad a stench. So they would have been in conditions like that. They sailed south from Cabinda. They captured another 3 schooners with Portuguese schooners off of Angola with slaves on board that they took. And then they sailed to Brazil. And off the coast of Brazil, the privateer who had captured them, a privateer named the Arabenta, was wrecked. And so John Smith, who was the prize master of the Antelope, didn't have the information the organizer of this had about where these slaves were to be sold. And so they sailed around the Caribbean to Suriname, to St. Martin, to St. Bart's, looking for a place to try to sell this cargo, and were unable to do so. They finally ended up off of St. Augustine, by that point, he was trying to sell the cargo for $100 a person, just trying to get rid of them.
So how long were the original captives on board?
They were taken captive in March of 1820, and they were brought into Savannah in the middle of July of 1820. So that's and they were literally ran out of water. In fact, I think most of the captives who died as a result of thirst. Yeah. And just one last thing, if you do have an interest and you do read the book, Savannah. Some of you probably have heard that Savannah was thought of as a haunt of pirates and other such things. I'm not sure there were so many pirates here, but I can tell you that the government of Savannah, the men who were running the government of Savannah, and many of the leading attorneys of Savannah were incredibly corrupt. And the U.S. Marshal himself, guys, think about this.
That's what they say today.
Well, I didn't say anything about today. This is 200 years ago. But the U.S. Marshal himself, now think about it, the main federal law enforcement official here in Savannah puts hundreds, ultimately, of these captives to work on his Cottingham plantation. In 1822, John Quincy Adams learns that he's boasting here in town that he's making $30,000 a year off the labor of these people, and that he intends to swamp them. And what he meant by that is to literally work them to death, because of course he hadn't had to pay anything for them. Yet at the same time, he puts together bills that he submits to the government for his care of these captives, ultimately billing the United States Navy for more than $36,000. Now, to put that in, there's both numbers, $30,000 and $36,000, would be more than $1 million in today's money. The Navy paid him $20,000 for the care of these captives. And that's your leading, and his house is still here on Orleans Square, that nice double house. And when Richard Richardson went bankrupt and had to give up, where Owens Thomas house is just right over there, isn't it? Had to give up the Owens Thomas house. Morrell had the money to buy all the furnishings, which were apparently glorious, from that house. So that's just one guy. I'm sorry if you're a Morrell descendant. They had at one time owned Ossabaw Island. You may know that. If not, you talk to Paul Presley and you'll find out all about it. I had no idea that I'd fallen into what turned out to be one hell of a story. There's just no other way to put this. And that's the only reason. I mean, I'm a nobody from Georgia Southern University, and I have a major press publishing the book. I'm, got a book tour. I'll be at the Decatur Book Festival and all these other sorts of things, just because the archives led me to an incredible story. Yeah, I saw some hands. Yes, we'll go like that and that.
You mentioned that when they were recolonized in Liberia, that it was a death trap.
Yeah.
What happened?
Mostly malaria, and the people who lived there who had no desire to be colonized were what happened. Malaria was endemic here. You guys probably know that. Every summer was a quote-unquote sickly season. And this was probably Vivax malaria, which you can live with. It weakens you, it makes you sick, you have the recurring up and down fever, the horrible shakes and bone pain, etc. But it is not a deadly form of malaria. That part of the African coast has a lot of falciparum malaria, which is the type that if you have not had it as a child, those parasites are going to kill you. So Yehudi Ashman, who was one of the founders, a clergyman, and his wife both went with all these dreams about, in Liberia, they could show that away from the oppressive conditions of slavery, that people of African heritage were just normal people, just like everybody else, and could be successful, build their own businesses and their own society. His wife died, horribly, within the first few weeks in Liberia. And he himself had recurrent bouts of malaria until he finally died 8 years later of the edema that you often get in your chest as a result of malaria. So yeah, it is a death trap to get, and people thought it's an odd thing, you probably hear this today, black people are immune to malaria. Well, there is the sickle cell structure that some people of the Mediterranean region and Africa have that gives you an element of resistance, particularly to Vivax malaria, but not everybody has that. In fact, most people from those regions don't have it. So they're still going to die. Yes?
I was just wondering what archives you went to carry out this comprehensive work.
This came out of my teaching. Constitutional history is one of the things that I teach, and I'm always trying to find cases that have something to do locally to motivate my students, because otherwise they don't do jack. I'm serious. You can stand with a club over them and they wouldn't do their reading. So I'd come upon this case a long time ago, and it's 17 or 18,000 words long. It's very complicated. It deals with admiralty law, which is a kind of obscure branch of the law. And so I said, no way I'm going to make students try to do this. But the case remained there in the back of my mind. And in 2010, I said, well, gosh, I need to figure out more about this. But again, it was hard getting information until during the summer of 2011 when I went to the branch of the National Archive that's in Mora, Georgia. I don't know if you guys know this, but we have a National Archive branch and the State Archive literally right next to one another. And I walked in, and the people said, oh gosh, those papers are scattered through everything. No one has ever used them. And so they pulled out box after box after box after box, and I started sorting through these boxes, and I started getting excited, and I started realizing, oh my gosh, no one has told this story, and I get my camera. I ended up making 2,200 images of documents from the National Archive. You saw one here, the one where they were dividing them up. From this branch of the National Archive. Then I had to go to the main National Archive in Washington, D.C. to look at the Supreme Court case materials and copy them. Then the Georgia State Archive offered materials. And Savannah City Archive, suddenly I saw online, here's posted, I didn't even have to go find it, the Antelope captives working for the city of Savannah, and I immediately came running down and found a great deal of support, etc. But I stole the images that you posted, so maybe my parking ticket money will go to a good cause.
I did want to mention Lacey's project last year that she worked with us on the Municipal Slavery Project was addressing the city's use of slaves to support municipal work, and she did include the Antelope in her research. So the website is actually savannahga.gov/slavery, and you can jump from there to her website and see the primary documents that are coming out of the clerk's records, that are coming out of the city archives, where she's digitized them, and provide a little bit more information about how we used those 51, and I say 51 because that's what our records say, those 51 African captives, how we cared for them or maybe didn't care for them. And so that's really interesting. So if you want to see more of the city government's role in that case, it is all online.
10 captives died in the city's control. They returned control to the marshal in April of 1821, so they had them from September 1 or so, maybe late August, to April. And during that time, of course, Savannah went through this horrible yellow fever epidemic, and I do not have any proof of this, but literally I have the image in my mind of these men who have been being used to level the fortifications that have been built around the city, also carrying bodies from the courthouse hospital to the graveyard. And I don't know if you know, the sexton of the graveyard became ill during the 1820 epidemic, and so the records got messed up because there wasn't even anybody recording the burials of white people. There was no requirement to record the deaths or the burials of black people here in town. I'm convinced 1,000 people died in this epidemic. Since the people fled, the only way to get away from a yellow fever epidemic was to flee. People didn't know about mosquitoes carrying it, but those mosquitoes really don't range more than a mile from where they are. So if you get away from the place where yellow fever is, as long as you haven't already gotten the virus, you're going to be okay. And so there were only about 1,400 people living in Savannah by October and November of 1820. So that you have 1,000 people die and so many other people flee, basically Savannah shut down. The city ceased to function. Even the mayor's wife died. Mayor Charlton's wife died. And he had published in the newspaper repeated denials that there was yellow fever in Savannah because he knew it was a business disaster. So denial after denial after denial. And I just wonder what he felt like when his own wife dies. Anyway, you're welcome to go if you want to. You're welcome to ask me questions. Do you have more?
Just one, I want to thank you, and a small token from the archives of appreciation for coming from Statesboro. I'm going to pass around some evaluation forms. If you have any comments about today's program or ideas for future programs, please share them with me. I also want to announce our next program, which is going to be Monday, May 11th at 10 a.m. It's going to be a walking tour at Laurel Grove South Cemetery, and Dr. Hugh Wilson's going to lead that. For those of you who came last year to our cemetery program, I really felt like Laurel Grove South got the short end of that program. So this is going to be entirely about that one cemetery. So I think that'll be great, and hopefully May won't yet be too hot for a morning walking tour. I do really want to thank you. I think this is great, and it's really good information for us, and helps us continue to raise our awareness about Savannah history. So I want to just give Dr. Bryant another thank you.
And I very much appreciate your attentiveness, seriously. Much better than my students.
And just a little side note, when he was talking, all of the city's records refer to the Antelope Case as Africans. And in our records, we see other people are referred to as slaves or Negroes, but these were always referred to as Africans. So somehow they were differentiating them.
Well, their legal status was uncertain, so they are called Africans, and yet at the same time, many judges refer to them as slaves, which I think reveals where their mindset was at the time.
If you'd like to take a granola bar with you, feel free, and Dr. Bryant will answer any other questions. I'm going to be talking to the Learning Center about